Let's read the Bible together. So the reading today is from 1 Kings 19 and verse 7 to 18. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night. And the word of the Lord came to him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too." The Lord said to him, "Go back the way you came, and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu son of Nimshi king over Israel. And anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat from Abel, Meholah, to succeed you as prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and whose mouths have not kissed him." Oh, this is the word of the Lord. Let's do it traditionally. There we go. Thanks, Matt. Thank you. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Phil, and I've been coming to St. Mary's for around 18 years, on and off. In my day-to-day job, I work for the Church of England, helping people to establish new churches, communities, and social entrepreneurships and enterprises kind of outside of the usual parish system. That's what I do day to day. I'm married to Jen, who's here. We have 3 boys that are probably tearing up kids' work this morning. But it's great to be able to have the opportunity to speak. I like to think of this Sunday in August as the one that can do the least damage. I think that's why they let me speak this week. But let's see how much damage we can actually do. Don't tell anyone. This is the 4th in a series of talks on Elijah, and Dream, Matt, and John have already spoken about earlier events in the life of Elijah, and you'll find those on our website, and they're all great. To start today, I'm going to have to do a little bit of a recap about some of those events to put into perspective where we are today. Here we go. A recap of the life of Elijah. So Elijah is renowned as one of the greatest prophets in the Old Testament. His name literally means the Lord is God, or Jehovah is God. And while we're at it, I have this little bugbear about the meanings of names, so I want to get this off my chest publicly. So I'm the youngest of 3 sons. My eldest brother is called Simon. That name means he has heard, or God has heard. And a great name for a firstborn son. My middle brother is called Matthew. Matthew means God's gift, or gift of God. Another, excellent name, well named, Matt. My full name is Philip, and that means lover of horses. So I don't know what's going on there. Maybe my parents don't care that much about names, or maybe they were just running out of boys' names by the time they got to me. But I've got nothing against horses, I have to say. I would like to point out that it's philo love, which means an appreciation of horses, rather than anything else which could cause any worry. But anyway, Elijah, his name means the Lord is God. And he kind of appears kind of out of nowhere in the story of Israel in the book of 1 Kings, in chapter 17. He turns up and he announces a famine because of the disobedience of the nation under King Ahab. Ahab's described as a king who had done more evil in the sight of the Lord than anyone else. And Matt spoke about Ahab previously in our series. He's really not a great guy. He's turned worship to Baal. He's married Jezebel, who is a worshipper of Baal, and he's just not a great guy. He's turned Israel away from God. So Elijah announces this famine. During the famine, Elijah is miraculously fed by God through ravens, an early Deliveroo thing made by God there. And then he also performs a miracle where he visits the family of a widow and makes the oil and flour of that widow not run out until the famine ends, so that he and their family are fed for the whole time. However, the son of the widow gets sick and dies, and so naturally Elijah calls out to God, and the son is brought back to life. He then goes to King Ahab to announce the end of the famine, but before he wants to announce the end of the famine, he challenges all the prophets of Baal, 450 prophets of Baal, to a contest where on Mount Carmel he proves that Yahweh is God by calling down fire from heaven to burn up a sacrifice. That is an amazing moment in the life of Elijah, and you could probably say it was the pinnacle of his public prophetic ministry. If you read the passage as well, as Matt spoke on it, he really enjoys it. Elijah really enjoys that. He's making jokes. He's telling them that their God's probably gone to the toilet. That's why he's not answering their prayers. Like he really makes a meal of that. He's having a great time. Directly after that, though, King Ahab goes and complains to his wife, Queen Jezebel, who says, okay, well, we're just going to have Elijah killed. And she sends a messenger to tell Elijah that he is going to be killed. So Elijah, this hero of the faith, this great prophet who has miraculously been fed by God, he's been used by God to raise someone from the dead. He's literally called on God to send fire down from heaven to burn up a sacrifice. So what does he do when he's confronted by this challenge? He runs for it. He absolutely pegs it out of there as quick as he can. And he runs for 100 miles away from where his problem is. And then he lays down under a tree and he says, oh, I've had enough. I just want to die. Now, there's a logical problem with this. You'd have thought if he wanted to die, he probably could have just stayed where Jezebel could have got him, and that would have kind of sorted out the problem. But no, he runs for 100 miles away from it. I guess he doesn't want to be killed, but he does want to die. It's an expression of his great despair and sadness of stuff going wrong. I remember a big fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Obviously, we always talk about Buffy in these sermons at St. Mary's, of course, natural. But I remember that line, Xander, who's a character in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, he's a bit down, so he says, I'm just going to go home, lie down, and listen to country music, the music of pain. And that's kind of where we find Elijah. He is flat out. He's at the bottom of his temperament, of his mood. He's really down. He's in despair. And so the first thing, from recapping the life of Elijah, I want to say is no one is immune to feeling that doubt and despair. Elijah, if you're going to look at a hero from the Old Testament, the stuff he achieves, the amazing miracles he performs, it's incredible. But even Elijah, faced with a bit of a challenge, just absolutely crashes down, runs away, and gets completely depressed and in despair. And so I want to say to us, encourage all of us, myself included, that if we are feeling like we're in a place like that, where we're feeling doubt and despair and depression, that it's happened to people throughout the history of the church, throughout the history of God's people. And I want to encourage you that if you are feeling like that, please speak to someone in the church. We partner with people at St. Mary's, with counsellors. You can find them on the website. If you speak to Matt or any of the staff here, they can link you up with people that can talk you through those issues. We also, obviously, there'll be a chance to be prayed with at the end of this meeting as well. So I'd encourage you to do that as well. But we meet Elijah in this pit of despair. And I think it's interesting that I think it's true in life that sometimes those feelings of despair can hit us hardest after we've had a real high point in our lives. So, or something we've done for God, or we've had a real achievement, and then that's when the doubt and despair hits us. So it might be that we've had an answer to prayer recently in our life, or we've been able to share our faith with a formerly cynical friend who actually turns out to be really open and listening to what we have to say. Or maybe we've invited someone to the life course dinner or to church and they've responded and come along. Or maybe we've seen someone's need met by the community here at the church, and it's encouraged us, and then something will happen, and it will just cut the legs from out of us, and we'll just crash down and feel really got at and attacked. In our passage, Elijah has had this experience on Mount Carmel. He's seen God work in an unbelievably powerful way, but then he immediately meets with this opposition, and it just wrecks him. It just wrecks him. So we should have a look at actually what does God do with Elijah when he's in that place? Well, you can see in our reading it says that God actually sends an angel to feed him and to give him water and lets him rest. I think for some of us, as we go through these dark times, we get quite frustrated with ourselves. I know I do that when I'm feeling down. I'm kind of like, oh, come on, just snap out of it. Let's get on with what we've got to do. It's just frustrating. But I think actually in this reading, we don't see that's not how God treats Elijah. He lets Elijah sit in that mood that he's in that depression, in that despair he's in. He takes care of his practical needs. He feeds him. He gives him a drink. He lets him rest. So the second thing I'm reminded of from this bit in Elijah's life is that actually God cares for Elijah, and he does the same for us as well. If we're in need of rest, if we're feeling like burnt out and at the end of our rope, if we're in need of comfort, God is totally up for providing that for us, totally up for meeting those needs in us through community, through his Spirit. Okay, so that's kind of the recap done, and that brings us right up to where we are in today's reading, and this is a perfect moment to drink the water. Very often when I bring a cup of water to speak, I then just ignore it for the rest of the time. There we go, sound effects. So at the beginning of our reading, Elijah wakes up from that first rest, and the angel of God comes to him again and says, get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. Now I want to point out that actually the angel hasn't told Elijah to go anywhere. And Elijah, at this point, has crashed out and doesn't appear to be moving anywhere. And yet, God knows that things aren't over for Elijah. He's going somewhere. He needs to eat and drink to get where he's going. And God seems to be just saying, okay, let's let this play out. Let's see where you're going, Elijah. And so where is Elijah going? Well, Elijah gets up and he keeps running. He is not done running yet. So he runs away another 200 miles. He's run 100 miles. He's going to run another 200 miles just to make sure. He goes through the wilderness to Mount Horeb. Now, Mount Horeb is otherwise known as Mount Sinai, the mountain of God. When the passage says that he travels for 40 days and 40 nights, that means he traveled for a long time. Just a little bit of biblical knowledge there for you. So as you might know, Mount Sinai is the place where Moses received the first covenant from God. He got the 10 Commandments on the top of Mount Sinai, and he met with God face to face. We don't know exactly why Elijah is heading to Mount Horeb or Sinai. We could conclude that it's the mountain of God. He wants to get back to somewhere important in the nation's history. It might be that he thinks, well, if I go to the mountain of God, maybe I'll hear more directly from God there. We don't know exactly why, but it makes logical sense. I guess 300 miles is a long way to go, but there you go. People will do that kind of thing. And I think actually we all do that kind of thing. When we've hit dark times, don't we revisit places where we think, actually, it used to be really great there. Maybe if I get back to that place, I'll be renewed. I'll be able to set out again in a different direction, try and recapture the past, try and recapture what's going on there. So maybe that's what he was doing. But Elijah is sat on this historic mountain, and the voice of God comes to him with this question, which I really love. What are you doing here, Elijah? So remember, before his epic journey of 300 miles, Elijah was in the middle of doing God's work in great power. He was showing the prophets of Baal who actually was God in Israel, and he was getting ready to take back the nation for God. But now he's shivering in a cave, alone and despondent. And God's question is, what are you doing here, Elijah? I think it's important to note that I don't get anger or impatience here from God. We have to remember that he's cared for Elijah and helped him get to where he was going. So he's obviously helped him get to this place. Rather, I think that it's clear to us that it's not where he's supposed to be. God has things for him to do, but he wants to know, what are you doing here, Elijah? Also, a little but important point, I think, God knows what Elijah is doing there. Wouldn't be a surprise for him. One of the things we know about God is that he's omniscient. He knows everything. So God knows what he's doing there. But he's asking Elijah so that Elijah can hear himself say why he's there. He makes this complaint to God. I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. Okay, so this is mostly true. This is mostly true. Elijah has been zealous, as we've heard. He's rebuked kings. He's embarrassed enemy prophets. It's also true that the nation's turning against God and worshipping other gods. But it's not true that Elijah is the only one left. Elijah himself has met Obadiah in chapter 18, who tells him that actually Obadiah has hidden 100 prophets in 2 caves to protect them from the slaughter that Ahab and Jezebel instructed. Conversely to that, the other thing that we know is that on Mount Carmel, in Elijah's great victory, he was alone on Mount Carmel. And it didn't bother him then. So what's changed? Well, what's changed is that actually Elijah feels like he's the only one left now. And I think that's the important thing to him. His feelings, his heavy feelings, are overriding the facts of what's going on. It's his feeling of being alone that's crushing him here. And that's important for us to note as well, because very often we can feel lonely, we can feel alone, and in a time of doubt and despair, that's just exacerbated. I think it's important for us to take a minute to look around and actually ask who is actually there with us. And that's one of the reasons why I encourage members of the church to join a small group, so that we have those people that know us and walk with us and can be with us when we're feeling alone. Again, you can find out about small groups on the website. It's good, I'm doing lots of adverts, Matt. It's great, it's good, it's good. Or you can speak to Matt, I think, about small groups, about how to get involved in those. So Elijah has a false perception of what his situation is. But God doesn't directly rebuke Elijah. He doesn't just go, well, you're wrong. Instead, he offers Elijah a closer encounter with him than ever before. God says that he'll pass by the cave where Elijah is hidden, and Elijah can come out and stand in his presence. Now, John mentioned last week that actually being in the presence of God in the Old Testament is quite a risky business. It's quite perilous to actually be in the presence of God. Many times in the Old Testament, if someone came in the direct presence of God, that meant they died. So it was normally left to great leaders like Moses to meet God face to face, or through the priesthood that was established under Aaron, who was Moses' brother. So Elijah's being given a huge privilege here by God, even though we might not think he's very deserving of it, because he's showing doubt, despair, and he's out of God's purposes. But God is inviting him to have an encounter with him. God is gracious, and he wants to meet Elijah in that place where he's down and where he's despairing. And I think the same is true for us. There's never a place we can get to where God doesn't want to meet with us and commune with us in that way. So, you have to get this picture. Elijah is waiting in a cave, ready to stand out, and God is about to pass by. And so the verse says that a great wind comes by, an earthquake and a raging fire pass by the cave, but God's not in any of them. Now, I really wanted to say at this stage that earth, wind, and fire went past the cave, because I think it would have been a great intro for a musical interlude I could have sung. Unfortunately, I triple-checked, it's not in that order. It's actually wind, earth, and fire. So close to being a classic 70s band. But God isn't in those things. I think it's interesting that the wind, earthquake, and fire, they must have been caused by God, right? You're not just on a mountain and then suddenly this huge wind comes and then this huge earthquake comes and then huge fire comes by. It's not like a normal thing to have happened. So if you heard the word of God say, oh, I'm going to invite you to come and be in my presence, you might well expect thunder, a bit of lightning, some fire, maybe, a bit of wind. Some indication. And after all, Elijah had experienced the power of God through fire on Mount Carmel, as we've said. So I think we can conclude that God is causing these things to happen, but it's interesting that the verse says that God is not in any of these things. The verse says actually that the wind goes before God. So maybe we conclude that actually it's the approaching of God's presence which causes those things, the wind and the earthquake and the fire. Okay, so a little bit of a tangent here. But it made me think, actually, of obviously we practice prayer ministry here at St. Mary's, and very often people will say that when they get prayed for, they might feel a breeze on their face or on their hands, or they might feel heat in their body, or they may shake or experience that kind of physical thing. And just the idea of this wind, earthquake, and fire made me think of those those signs of God's presence. But I wanted to talk to people because I know that there's lots of people, and myself, I've been like this. I've had periods of time where it's like this, where I don't experience any physical thing when I'm being prayed for. And very often people might say, I just don't feel I'm experiencing God because I'm not experiencing those physical manifestations. And this bit of the verse just made me think that actually they may be signs that God's presence is there, but they don't actually have to be the presence of God. So if you get prayed for and you don't experience those things, please don't feel that you're missing out on God. God's presence is separate to those things. They're just signs of things. I encourage you to keep getting prayer, even if you're not feeling those physical manifestations. Okay. Earth, wind, and fire. God's not in those. He's not in those signs. But the reading tells us that when those have passed, he's found in a still small voice, or a gentle whisper. The literal translation of the Hebrew here is a voice of thin silence, kind of the silence after the noise of those three signs. God appears to Elijah as the quietest whisper, or even in silence after the signs that he's heard. Could God be saying to Elijah, yeah, you've called down fire. I was with you in fire on Mount Carmel. Yes, you've raised the dead. I was with you then. Yes, you've challenged kings, and I was with you then. But right now, that is not the essence of our relationship. What you're hearing from me now is that I want to meet with you, you and me, together in this silence, in this quiet on the mountain. I think it's interesting that actually that's what God has shown Elijah on his journey to the mountain as well, that when Elijah is down and despairing and washed out, that God has come quietly and met with him and met his needs in a quiet and still way. When everything else stops, God is still there with Elijah in the quiet. Now, this may be just the way my mind works, but does anyone else find it really funny that when Elijah goes to talks with God, he wraps a cloak around his head? Or is that's just me? So I imagine for the rest of the reading, whenever Elijah talks, you have to imagine it's because he's got a cloak around his head. I resisted doing that in the reading, but it just made me chuckle. But the reason he's doing that is obviously, as I said, in the Old Testament, meeting with God was perilous. And so he's trying to not meet God directly face to face, and so he covers his face with a cloak. That's why he does it. It's not a fashion thing. He's trying to protect himself. What I find interesting is that when he goes out to meet with God, God actually asks him the same question. What are you doing here, Elijah? I don't think he was asking, why have you got a cloak over your head? I think it was more like, why are you here again? Why are you here? It's the same question. Now this time, we know that God already knows why Elijah's there because he's omniscient. And we know that Elijah has already heard himself say why he's there. So what is God doing asking this question again? Well, I think actually God is giving Elijah an opportunity to change. God's giving Elijah an opportunity to rethink why he's there. After the revelation of their relationship, the reminding of Elijah that God is with him, what will his response be to the same question? He's saying, Elijah, why are you here? We've got things to do, things we need to get on with. God's moving forward, and I believe that Elijah was being invited by God to get back on the horse with God again and get going. So if this was a Hollywood movie, after this question, I think probably we would smash cut to Jezebel and Ahab, 300 miles away. Maybe they're doing a bit of idol worship or something where they are. I don't know, they're chilling. And then we would just hear a rumbling, and they'd look up from their idol worship, and they'd look out across the desert, and there they would see Elijah running back over the desert. Not running, he's flying on a cloud of fire across the desert, and he's coming to smite the worshippers of Baal. And then the soundtrack would kick in, and we'd all cheer, and then someone would film us cheering, and then we'd become a meme, and people would share our meme on the internet about how Elijah returned from the mountain in fire and defeated the prophets of Baal. Albeit with a cloak wrapped around his head. But the point is that actually he doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. That is not what happens. Even after the new revelation from God, and God asking the same question, what are you doing here, Elijah? Elijah replies with exactly the same complaint that he had before. He says again, I've been very zealous for you, but people are worshipping other gods. They're killing people, they're killing your prophets, and I'm the only one left, and they're looking to kill me. He says exactly the same thing again. He's not changed how he feels at all. And so, God takes this as the beginning of the end of Elijah's ministry. I was struck by John's talk last week when he said that God will not compel you. God will not compel you. And that's what we see here. God's welcomed Elijah into his presence, but Elijah doesn't change his mind or his heart. And so God graciously tells Elijah that his ministry will come to an end. And he says that Elisha will take over from him in the place of God's purposes. He even says to Elijah that there's 7,000 people in Israel who haven't abandoned God. And so he isn't alone after all. But that's the beginning of the end of Elijah's story. And I really love, actually, that this story is in the Bible. Because at this point in Elijah's life, it's actually a real failure in his journey. He has not turned around and come back into God's purposes. Elijah coming down from Mount Carmel, from that sacrifice where he called fire down from heaven, is shattered by opposition from Jezebel. And God graciously allows him to retire. Now, no spoilers, but Elijah actually has a couple more of encounters with Ahab, and something very special happens at the end of his time. But Kirstine's going to talk about that next week, so I don't want any spoilers, but tune in next week for that. But this is the beginning of the end of his story, but it's not the end of Elijah's story. I'm going to skip the last bit that Kirstine will talk about last week, but I want to flash forward 900 years from this point in history. 900 years from Elijah on Mount Horeb, and we're going to visit another mountain. So in Matthew 17, it says this: After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. I really love this story in the context of what we've learned about Elijah today. So Moses and Elijah, who are actually two people who didn't finish the task they were given by God. You remember that Moses couldn't enter the promised land because he misheard God and didn't do what God said. And also Elijah, we've heard today, didn't finish the purposes of God had for him. But there are also two people who are really famous for meeting with God on a mountain. I just love the fact that when Jesus goes up the mountain with his closest disciples, the two people that appear to him are these people that didn't finish what God had in store for them, but they're chatting to him again on the mountain. God in the flesh, in Jesus, on the mountain, chatting again with Moses and Elijah. I think what that says to us is that Jesus is the completer of the story of Moses. Jesus is the fulfilment of the story of Elijah. He is finishing those things which Moses and Elijah started but couldn't finish. God is graciously showing Elijah and Moses that it's everything they've done has built to this moment. And I believe as well that Jesus is the wholeness of whatever brokenness we experience in our lives right now. How gracious is God? I just love that. I love that bit. So where does that leave us this morning? Well, I think some of us today might be feeling in a place where Elijah was. He's despondent and despairing. And I believe that God wants to meet you in that place, give you rest, and lead you out of it. And some of us might actually be done with the work that God's given us. Maybe we're at a time of change in our lives and we just feel done with what we're doing and we feel it's too much and we want to lay it down. And I want to say to you that actually this reading tells us that God is ready to take that from you. God is ready to take that from you, and he'll provide a way for that work to continue. But maybe you feel that you're in a place where God's saying to you, what are you doing here? Maybe you're a bit stuck and you're feeling a bit lost, but you're feeling you want to get back into God's purposes for your life. God's calling you back to what he would have you do. Well, it's our practice in St. Mary's to pray for people at the end of the service. And so I want to say if any of those things have resonated with you, or if you have anything that you'd like to pray with us for, please do come forward as the band leads us in some worship. And we'd love to pray with you about any of those things.